I want to start our conversation today about dating in the technological era by taking a step back into the 1800s. In preparing for this talk, I listened to a podcast episode on the show The Secret History of the Future, which is produced by the publication Slate and The Economist. The episode of the show is called Dots, Dashes, and Dating Apps. The show starts in a rather unusual place, with the bicycle. First invented in 1817, the bicycle was mass-produced starting in the 1860s and 70s. Its invention allowed people to expand outside their neighborhoods with more ease, and as they did, many of them kept notes in their journals called wheeling diaries. One of the guests of the podcast, Evan Friss, an associate professor at James Madison University, shares a particular wheeling diary he discovered in his research. It's from the 1890s. A man named Arthur Hyde, who lived in New York City with his family, kept a meticulous journal of every bike ride he took. It spanned thousands of miles and included who he was with, most of them women, Helen, Ethel, Lena, and the list goes on, Professor Friss says. And it's clear he's using the bicycle to date women, to meet women, to take them to ice cream shops, restaurants, out on dates. Friss continues, he ultimately married a woman that he, in fact, dated using the bicycle. As it turns out, this cool new tech gizmo happened to be a great way to meet potential romantic partners, the show's podcast hosts say. Professor Friss and Slate and The Economist, in fact, point out that romantic couplings like that of Arthur Hyde were relatively common in the 19th century. The bicycle invented a new style of dating in its day, and while it didn't look quite how dating on apps looks today, there are some similarities. For people in the 1800s, the bicycle provided freedom to move outside a few block radius more easily and quickly, making it easier to keep up relationships outside your own neighborhood and community. That meant you could also date outside the close watch of your neighbors and parents who might not see who you're coming and going with if you rode your bike to another part of town, taking some of the pressure off of a date. Both of these qualities are qualities we see in online dating, or just general online communication, the ability to meet and date and befriend people who are outside of your current social sphere, and the ability to keep some of those relationships private for a period of time, taking some pressure off of especially the early courtship process, which is full of flirting and sometimes awkward moments as we fumble over our feelings of infatuation. But the similarities between the bicycle and dating apps sort of end there. But the podcast goes on to talk about another form of communication, also in the 1800s, that mirrored our technological communication today, the telegraph. While sending personal messages between telegraph operators was strictly prohibited, operators, many of whom were young adults, when they weren't sending messages for paying customers, would talk to each other and strike up relationships. They even had casual shorthand that mirrors some of our text shorthand that we use today. For example, SFD meant stopping for dinner, not too similar to BRB. GA meant go ahead. Ha meant something was funny. GM for good morning, and so on. And while dating over the telegraph didn't happen per se, there were dreams of it. A young woman named Ellen Cheever Thayer, who was once a telegraph operator herself, wrote a well-read book in the 1800s called Wired Love, A Romance of Dot and Dashes. The book is a fictional account detailing a budding romance that developed over the telegraph wire. Its imagination for dating and courtship process is eerily similar to what online dating looks like today. Natty, the protagonist in the story, is falling for another telegraph operator, C. Natty is naturally shy and bookish, the show hosts explain, making this form of flirting more comfortable for her because, number one, she can control what she says and how she flirts, preventing awkward slip-ups. Two, she can date in privacy without her nosy landlady and her friends seeing her come and go with a potential suitor early on. Natty even gets conned when someone over the wire realizes she's talking to C and he wants to win her affection, so he comes in and tries to pretend he's C, and she realizes by deducing things that he's not in fact C, but she fell for it for a little bit. And when she finally meets the real C, whose name is Clement, there is an awkward adjustment period that looks very similar to how it would look today. When you meet someone online, you learn a lot about them over the course of reading a profile and messaging. And then when you finally get in person, you realize things about their personality or voice are not quite how you imagine them to be. And so there's a bit of an adjustment period. There's also sometimes slip-ups in what you say or how you act that don't come across as carefully curated as the way that we write to one another in messages online. The novel also eerily describes and really actually kind of dreams for the future of dating, which we can see ourselves in. On the podcast, they read a paragraph of the novel, and it goes like this. We will soon be able to do everything by electricity. Who knows? But some genius will invent something for the especial use of lovers. Something, for instance, to carry in our pockets, so that when we're far away from each other and pine for the sound of that beloved voice, they will have to only take up this electrical apparatus, put it to their ears, and be happy. Ah, blissful lovers of the future. Obviously, we have that thing in our pockets that we can connect to one another at any other time. And let's be honest, my generation and the college generation below me are more likely to send a text than we actually are to pick up the phone and call each other, as Thayer suggests in the passage. But the goods associated with it, and while the goods associated with that technology, I think outweigh the bads, it hasn't all been blissful. With each invention of technology that shifts communication, there's been understandable concern about how that shift will impact relationships. But the smartphone brought with it more than just a communication shift. It has fundamentally changed not just how we communicate, but how we form and maintain relationships. Researchers like Jean Twenge are noting that the popularity of the smartphone is associated with dramatic changes in emotional and social behavior during adolescent years. Writing for The Atlantic in 2017, in a piece titled Have Smartphones Destroyed a Generation, she writes, I have been researching generational differences for 25 years, starting when I was a 22-year-old doctoral student in psychology. Typically, the characteristics that come to define a generation appear gradually and along a continuum. Beliefs and behaviors that were already arising simply continue to do so. Millennials, for instance, are a highly individualistic generation, but individualism has been increasing since the baby boomers turned on, tuned in, and drop out. I've grown accustomed to line graphs of trends that looked like modest hills and valleys. But then she begins studying what she now calls iGen, born between 1995 and 2012. She continues on. Around 2012, I noticed abrupt shifts in teen behaviors and emotional states. The gentle slopes of line graphs became steep mountains and sheer cliffs, and many of the distinctive characteristics of the millennial generation began to disappear. In all of my analysis of generational data, some reaching back to the 1930s, I have never seen anything like it. As she looked closely into what might be causing it, she claims the cause was the rise of smartphone alongside the growing popularity of social media. She notes observations we're all likely familiar with: a dramatic increase in depression and suicide among teenagers, a decreased desire for what was considered traditional independence, like getting a driver's license. But most compellingly for our conversation today, a decline in social activity, a decline in dating, and a decline in sexual activity among high school students. Teens spend most of their time these days at home, in their rooms, and on their phones, interacting with their friends via text message, games, and social media, instead of at the mall, the movies, or once other typical teenage activities. But it's not just adolescents who have experienced a shift in their relationships. A major survey conducted by Cigna, released in May 2018, announced that loneliness in America has reached epidemic levels. Among their findings, nearly half of Americans report sometimes or always feeling alone or left out. Generation Z, which are adults ages 18 to 22, is the loneliest generation and reports the most health concerns. Only around half of Americans, 53%, have meaningful in-person social interactions, such as having an extended conversation with a friend or spending quality time with the family on a daily basis. 1 in 4 Americans, 27%, rarely or never feel as though there are people who really understand them. 1 in 5 report they rarely or never feel close to people or feel like there are people that they can talk to. The Cigna study notes that social media use alone is not a predictor of loneliness. Respondents defined as very heavy users of social media have a loneliness score that is not markedly different from the score of those who never use social media. Another major survey about loneliness, released by Kaiser and The Economist early this year, found, for example, that for some, social media like Snapchat and Instagram may help them feel more connected for their friends. But for others, scrolling through carefully curated photos can make people feel they're missing out and lonely. I'd argue that the difference in those feelings of connection could be specific to the day and the context of your scrolling. So take, for example, you're having a good day, you're happy, you just had a great conversation with a friend, and you see a cute photo of your other friend and her boyfriend on Instagram, and it makes you happy because you're already happy. So you click that like button. But then 2 days later, you find out the guy you had a crush on is dating someone else. And now you're kind of bummed out, and you see another picture of your friend and her boyfriend. And now that's not as fun to see, and actually it makes you feel more left out and like you're more behind. There's so much that goes into our technology use, our personality, our moods on any given day or hour, the platforms we use and don't use, and more. Even the differences between the current college generation use of technology and my use of technology is profound, given that, for example, social media was not invented until I was halfway through college, and texting was barely a norm. I had friends that did not have cell phones through all of college. Whereas for the college generation today, social media started when you were in middle school, as did texting. Which has a profound difference on the way that you make friends, communicate with your friends, spend time with your friends. But those differences don't change objective realities of how they've impacted us today. And so hopefully in our conversation, we'll be able to hone in on some of those truths so that you can take with you in your search for love and companionship. And so that brings me to how I want to spend our time together. What I'm going to do is to talk about how some of these changes have created what I see are double-edged swords. So there's goods to some of the changes that smartphones and social media and technology has given us, but there's also risks or bads or things to be on the lookout for that can hinder our ability to form good relationships. And so from there, I'm going to, after we explore as we're exploring some of the double-edged swords, talk about ways to avoid some of the pitfalls, as well as offer some tips of how to just generally sort of swing back from over technology use. For the purposes of this talk, I'll be focusing more on romantic relationships, as that's the topic of the conference. But that said, during the Q&A especially, I think a lot of it could be applied to friendships, and during the Q&A, I'd be glad to wade into the conversation about friendships as well. Before I jump into those double-edged swords that I've identified, I want to talk about when we first started using computers and dating, because it's both interesting and it also lays some of the foundation about how we view computers and relationship formation today. So the first time the computer was used to facilitate dating was in the 1960s. Computers were new. They were the size of a room, if you can imagine it, and they were very rare. A group of men from Harvard had over the summer worked at an actuary firm and used a computer in their work there, and had thought, if this could make finding a spouse more efficient, wouldn't that be great? So they went back to school and they came up with this idea to start a company called Operation Match. I learned about this through another podcast called Operation Match by a show called Undone, produced by Gimlet Media. The show explains that the standard way to meet people in the 1960s were what they called mixers, and they were basically a dance. There was punch, there was a live band, there were men and women. A lot of colleges were still, all girls and all boys schools, so they would come together. And because of the social norms, men would stand on one side of the room, women would stand on the other side of the room, and wait to be asked by a man to dance. And the way they describe it, they play some music in the background. They describe that it was sometimes awkward, the way that, you would have this brief meeting and then you would dance, and maybe dates would come from it. But especially if you were attending an all-girls school, as they describe in one young woman she wasn't a young woman, she married through Operation Match, but she, halfway through her senior year, felt stuck, like she wasn't meeting anyone. And in comes Operation Match. With the tagline, "You're one in a million, no one else is quite like you." And they claimed the computer can find the right date for a person in a split second when it might take an individual 3 to 4 years alone to do it. So here's how it worked. The men and women would fill out a survey of about 100 questions, your basic, age, religion, basic kind of details like that, interests, what hobbies are you interested in? But it also had some situational questions like, what would you do if your roommate set you up on a blind date and she wasn't that good looking? Or what would you do if you came across an unfinished crossword puzzle? And so people would fill these out, and on Operation Match, located in Boston, charged people $3 to run the survey through a machine. It kind of looked like a Scantron it sounds like they just punched out holes, ran it through, and what the computer would do is match you with other people in the system who had answered similarly. Now, the men, it's interesting to listen to. The computers were very expensive, so they didn't own one. And so they called up IBM in the area and struck up a deal for better rates, is what they said. And IBM said, well, no one uses the computer in the middle of the night. So if you come in the middle of the night, it won't cost you that much. And so they said, okay. And they interviewed one of the co-founders, and he said, we didn't think we would be doing it more than a couple hours a week. So we thought, we could give up one night of sleep. But so at 3 a.m. is when they'd run these Scantrons. But because they got so much press, including an appearance on the late night show during the time, they actually had over 1 million customers and became a very successful business. The show interviews Anita and Michael, who met in the 60s via Operation Match. They married and had been married for 50 years at the time of the recording. And the show emphasized that they connected on their shared Catholic faith, their shared values about family, and their shared love of English. But Anita was a dancer, and Michael never stepped foot on a dance floor. And so the show emphasized they would have never met had it not been for Operation Match. The founders of Operation Match sold their company upon graduating university because, as one of the co-founders said, we didn't think it was a serious business and that it was actually going to take off. So he said, I don't think we even sold it for a lot of money. He couldn't recall how much they sold it for. The company kind of petered off and went away at some point after they sold it. And then in between then, there was some other online dating that happened. It wasn't quite like Operation Match where it involved a questionnaire. It was more like there was examples of like video dating where you would go and you'd film a video and then you could go in a booth in the mall and watch these videos, and if you liked them, I guess you could somehow pay money to get their contact information. But it wasn't quite the same as this questionnaire that promised finding a soulmate until the creation of eHarmony in the year 2000. eHarmony consisted of a comprehension survey asking a range of questions about various moral issues like how you felt about pornography and premarital sex, to personal preferences like hobbies, interests. In the earliest days of eHarmony, they leaned heavily into the idea that their algorithm would match you with your soulmate, and they did use that language. In 2006, they boosted the success of 16,000 marriages a year, which is more than 43 marriages a day, as a result of their sophisticated matching system. In recent years, eHarmony, I believe, is still functioning. In recent years, I think everyone, including dating companies, have come to realize that no algorithm can help you find your soulmate. That's on you. Many of us would argue that there's not a soulmate, but certainly that the soulmate mentality has made the task of finding someone to date to head towards marriage and to decide to marry very daunting. And so with that, I want to start with the first double-edged sword that this set up, which was this idea that there's access to anyone in the world, the World Wide Web, as it was first talked about a lot. You can now literally meet, date, and keep up a relationship with anyone. This has some pretty obvious benefits. For example, staying together with a serious boyfriend or girlfriend while you're at different colleges, or finishing a fellowship while she's finishing school, or those things like that. It also has the benefit of you have a shared specific trait that you would like to, if you have a specific trait that you would like to share with a partner. So for example, shared faith or shared values of how you want to raise a family, and it's a very small group of people that share that trait, to be able to broaden your pool of people that you can meet and date across state lines, have, your aunt in another state set you up with someone that she met at church, date and form a relationship, is obviously a very, very good thing. But the expansion of who we can date with comes with some pretty big drawbacks that have been pretty well documented. The first of which is what Barry Schultz calls the paradox of choice, or choice paralysis. When our options are seemingly limitless, our ability to trust we're making the best choice becomes clouded, and as the name suggests, we become paralyzed to the point of not making a decision. Professor Scott Stanley, in an article for the Institute of Family Studies, compares it to waiting for a train. When you know how many trains are going to pass through a station in any given day, and you also know what it is you're looking for, you can know when the best train is for you and what you need. But if you don't know how many trains, or in this case, how many potential partners you might have, choosing the best one for you is going to be particularly difficult. And you might find that you choose someone and then you're looking back and realizing, oh, maybe that person before was better because I didn't know what my options were. Choice paralysis has been cited in numerous reports detailing our nation's rising age of marriage, which is at historic highs of age 30 for men and age 28 for women, and the decline of marriage generally in our present day. But choice paralysis is not only caused by seemingly limitless options, so the ability to date anyone in the world, but it's also caused by lack of awareness of what best means when it comes to finding a spouse. Which brings me, I think, to the second double-edged sword, which is how online dating has helped us and hindered us in finding the best spouse for ourselves. So, and I would say online dating, but I'd also say just generally creating a social media profile or having a social media presence. So having a social media presence or having a presence of yourself on the internet, whether it be in a dating context or not, has allowed us to reflect on what are the things we value? How do we want other people to see the things we value? What do we value in other people? What is it that we're drawn to when we look at other people's profiles or read things that they've put out? But this self-reflection can have its limit. What draws a person to you might not be what you think should draw them to you. You might think someone who makes you laugh in a certain way or has a certain personality type is really important, but chemistry, that illustrious factor that draws us often to one another, surprises us a lot. I'll use a couple examples. I know a woman who was particularly tall, and she felt she needed a man who was at least her same height or taller, because she herself was over 6 feet tall. Her family and friends even encouraged this point when she online dating, and she set a filter to match this criteria. When she met her husband at a goodbye party for a friend, she noted that he was much shorter than her criteria she had set online, but she was instantly drawn to him when she met him and hoped, I hope he asked me out. He did in fact ask her out. They are in fact married. And what's interesting, and that was something that she reflects on, is that had they met online, because of his height, he wouldn't have even been filtered in her returns, or she wouldn't have given him a second look. And yet their height difference has never been an issue in their relationship. Similarly, I know countless couples that consist of one person who would be defined as very type A, very organized, very scheduled, very disciplined, and another personality who is very laid back. We think sometimes that these big differences in personalities or in certain traits matter, but what matters is how we respond to our differences. Professor Mark Regnerus once wrote, "Marriage at its best is a formative institution." And I think we'd be wise to consider that perspective more. Those who wait to live together until after marriage often marvel at how much they didn't know about a person they thought they knew so well. He sings in the shower. She can't keep her cap on the toothpaste for the life of her. He's quiet in the morning. She stays up way later than feels humanly healthy. But all of these examples, the character of the person and the depth of the relationship has not changed. And while you might have had visions of early morning deep chats over coffee, the absence of those chats likely won't change the happiness you feel to be with the man or the woman that you've chosen to marry. You'll learn how to give more than you take, to fight fairly, to give the benefit of the doubt more than you keep score, and so goes the process of being formed into a better person. Just like in friendships and dating, where it takes a while to feel comfortable and to find a rhythm in what works for the relationship, there's a similar adjustment period in marriage. But those rhythms will also change over time as bigger life moments happen, like when you add kids or when you don't because of infertility or miscarriage, as demands like jobs, new houses, illnesses, and more enter the equation. Wisdom says we can't know what we don't know, and that includes the fact that we don't know how our lives are going to be shaped by the circumstances outside of our control. I was thinking a lot this morning about what Brandon said last night about conviction masking confusion, and I think it's a profound point, and one that we also might want to turn on ourselves sometimes. What are those deal breakers that we're convicted about when we're looking for a spouse that might be a sign of confusion or even fear? Is the need for him to be more type A perhaps related to your fear of loss of control? Are your height and appearance criteria related to your own insecurities about appearance and what others might think of you? I want to be clear here that I don't think all of our convictions about who we want to date and marry are masked for confusion. I think it's very important. Shared values are very important and bear repeating. Sharing how you look at certain truths and how you look at how you're going to raise your kids make a big difference in a partnership and starting a family, and they can't be undervalued or underscored as less important. But when it comes to matters of physical appearance or personality traits and quirks, it's worth asking yourselves, what does this trait mean to me? And is it possible I hold too tightly out of fear of being asked to grow in virtue? Similarly, when dating, it's important to look at, is there the ability to grow together? Does the person that you're dating, are they also willing to grow in virtue and to be accommodating at times or to sacrifice? Which brings me to the third double-edged sword I see, not just with online dating, but social media and even texting and email. The ability to curate our feeds, to write perfectly crafted messages that communicate exactly what we want to say, that allow us to put our best foot forward at all times. What does that do to our ability to embrace whole, flawed human beings, which we all are? If you're someone who struggles with social anxiety, or if you're shy, the ability to communicate online allows a forum for you to say how you really feel without freezing in the moment. For all of us, social media and online dating profiles allow us to put forward to the world and potential partners the best version of ourselves, or the version that we would like most seen. Similarly, we can follow up after an encounter with a brief text, correcting the record on something we said or didn't say, or emphasizing something we felt wasn't clear. And this can be helpful in the forming and the maintaining of a relationship. But the other side of the sword, of course, is that we're all flawed human beings who come with our own quirks and blind spots. We're going to put our foot in our mouths sometimes, act in a way that is hurtful to those we love, or have moments that are less desirable than others. The constant consumption of carefully curated pictures and texts may be lowering our threshold of tolerance and acceptance for those very human moments. Does the fact that we're able to have a profile for someone before we really get to know them as a person make us less patient when they don't end up matching the vision we've consciously or unconsciously created in our heads? This is a point that I think is not just specific to online dating, but also just to how we make friends and build relationships. Think about the process you go through when you meet a new person. Perhaps you get their phone number or email or plan for the next time you're going to see them. But likely you also follow them on Instagram or Twitter, or add them on Snap, or join a GroupMe or some other social media technological way of connection. And you might find yourself consuming information about them, but that information is very two-dimensional. So you're looking at pictures, you're looking at articles they shared, you're looking at ways that they responded to comments, but what you don't know are tone, background information, the opportunity to inquire more about this or that thing. So, for example, you might see, oh my gosh, everything that that girl posts is about baseball, and I think baseball is the most boring sport ever. I don't, by the way, but I'm using this as an example. I think baseball is the most boring sport ever. I could never hang out with someone that loves baseball so much. But what if you found out that the reason that she loves baseball is because her father taught it to her, and a few years ago he passed away, and this is her way of memorializing him and part of the legacy that he left for her? Would that change the way that you see how she talks about baseball? Probably, but I think we're so used to taking in these short snippets that we forget to inquire about the deeper meaning behind those short snippets. Which brings me to my final double-edged sword, how online dating, social media creates this forum where how online dating in particular creates a forum where we can assume the other person is looking for romantic connection. And this definitely makes more efficient, as the co-founders of Operation Match or any other online dating company would tell you they hoped for. But it doesn't always make it simpler. A growing body of research has found, so here's the goods. A growing body of research has found that couples who met online report to be happier, have higher compatibility, and move from dating to marriage at a quicker pace than those who have met offline. But researchers are quick to note this is correlation, not causation. It could be that those who use online dating are more reflective and more serious about getting married than those who are dating offline. And there's no question, if you're looking to get married, online dating gives you a clear way to take matters into your own hands by putting yourself out there, asking someone out, and matching with someone who also is looking to get married. But I'd argue that online dating has contributed to the uncomfortableness and male-female relationships that we often feel today. There once was a day when a single man and woman showed dedicated attention to each other. It was assumed that dating would lead to marriage. I think someone pointed out last night, not everyone is interested in marriage today, so we can't assume that attention being shown between men and women is necessarily pointed out towards marriage. It could be that he's showing me attention because he's hoping I'll go home with him tonight and get in bed with him. It could be that she's dating you for a long time because she likes the companionship and it's comfortable, but her career actually is more important than getting married and having children. These are conversations that aren't always being had in dating relationships. Online dating creates a forum where you could know what people's intentions are more clearly. Is she flirting with me because she's friendly? No, she's online dating. She's flirting with me because she's hoping I'll ask her out. There's a little bit more clarity than sometimes our in-person encounters give us. But I loved that Mary last night left the charge to be bold. And I think that one way that we can be bold as people who want to revive a marriage culture and maintain a marriage culture is to really strive to take our relationships offline and put them more in person. I think whether you meet online or don't, opting to focus on growing the relationship completely free of not only just like online communication, but I would argue even something like texting could actually produce a much more thoughtful dating encounter. And I want to use an example from a fascinating article I read in The Cut, which is a kind of a young adult publication produced by the New York Magazine. The author of the story, a young woman, she was in her 20s, talks about dating a man. She was dating a man she liked, and on the third date, he suggested that they not text each other anymore. She found the idea thrilling, she explained. She writes, "At this point, I had recently noticed a pattern in my dating habits. I'd meet someone, and next thing I knew, we were texting more frequently than I text my best friends. The difference, of course, is that texting your best friends is a fun diversion, whereas texting someone you're interested in can feel exhilarating, but also exhausting. Every interaction is laden with meaning. How long should I wait to write back? What does his delay imply? Is an exclamation point too much? Should I add a winking face emoji?" She goes on to explain, we all know this, right? Those who have dated and used texting can relate to that. The author goes on to explain, "In the past, dating someone new would leave me feeling drained and weirdly sad. It wasn't just that I was unsure of the guy's feelings. It happened with people I knew really liked me. Looking back, I think the sadness came from a subconscious knowing that the person wasn't right for me. But at the time, I didn't have the space to fully process that, in part because I wasn't available at all times via my phone. Even if I didn't respond to a text right away, the message would be hanging over me and firing warning signs back in the other direction. Unlike a friendship, where not responding to a text for 2 days, for 2 hours or 2 days, is acceptable in dating, both the act of texting and not texting communicate something. How fast or how slow you respond says something to the other person." So this young woman and her boyfriend at the time agreed that they would only text about logistics, what time you're going to be where, if someone needed a key ingredient for a dinner that they were hosting at their house, those details. But other than that, there'd be no good morning text, there'd be no good night text, there'd be no what I'm doing today, this, that, or the other thing. And she found that with each encounter, it was more exciting because they had more to talk about because they hadn't talked to each other. So they had no idea how they spend each other's days and they could really unpack it. She, then they did in the brief notes via text. But most importantly, the author writes, "I could miss him. And doing so helped me understand how I felt about this person, something that had been clouded by all the superfluous, though sweet communication in the past." We can imagine, too, that it would work in the opposite way. In this case, she liked the guy, but you can imagine that if you didn't miss the person that you were dating, it would make things much clearer, right? Interestingly, the way that this couple agreed to set it up is that by the end of each encounter, they would have established if they were going to go out again and make the plans to go out again. I think that has a lot of implications for ghosting, this idea that we just stop talking to one another. It would be much harder to ghost if you have to make a plan of whether or not you're going to see each other again. And that obviously personalizes the relationship more. Anyone who's been ghosted knows it's an odd feeling to wait for days or weeks until you finally kind of at some point just rationalize in your head, okay, he's probably or she's probably not going to text me again. What's even more uncomfortable is when sometimes you will still hear from that person several weeks or months later after you've already determined that they didn't like you. And now you're wondering, well, do they really like me? Or are they just bored or lonely or looking for someone to spend time with? But by sorting out some of those feelings in person, a lot of that is taken off of the table. The rise of popularity for things like No Scroll Saturday, which I see a lot on Instagram, or hashtags like Opt Offline and other anti-technology campaigns indicate that our culture is starting to understand that being online in every waking moment of every day is limiting our ability to live a well-rounded, deeply fulfilling life. I think those interested in advocating for a stronger marriage should be at the front of that charge, putting technology and relationship formation in its proper place. Not just because technology depersonalizes connection and increases our ability to objectify people, which it does, you heard about that earlier today, but because our constant usage of it interferes with our ability to truly self-reflect and engage with each other more deeply. Instead of leaning on technology to do the hard work for us of, say, breaking up with someone, or saying something uncomfortable, or apologizing for something we said or didn't say, what if we pushed against our instincts and were bold enough to speak truth face to face, or at least over the phone, as Thayer envisioned the blissful lovers of the future would? Which leads me to some practical tips that I want to leave you with. Just a few suggestions of how you can increase your self-awareness and deepen your relationships in the technological era. The first is I would suggest spending time paying close attention to your own technology use. Take a day or even a week and notice, and if I could be bold to say, write down every time you reach for your phone. Why are you reaching for it? What are you doing? You know, the 1800s, they had the wheeling diaries. These could be the data diaries. Pay attention to things like not only what you're reaching for it for, but what you're feeling as you're reaching for it. Are you anxious? Are you bored? Are you lonely? Would texting a friend, or better yet, calling a friend, get rid of those feelings? Are you standing in line? Just bored, waiting to stand in line? Could you talk to the stranger in front of you or behind you? Interestingly, The Economist, when they released their study with Kaiser, pointed out that exploring loneliness is an interesting thing because loneliness is a feeling. And so researchers asked your perceived feeling of being left out, or your perceived feeling of not having people, which leads to the question, is it possible that there are people in your life that would be willing to talk with you and you just haven't been able to find a way to talk to them? You haven't found a way to ask them to enter into a relationship. So I think these data diaries of our own could help us determine, I'm feeling alone right now. I could call my sister. I bet she would answer the phone. Now I'm not alone. Now I have someone to talk to. Loneliness in and of itself, I want to emphasize, is not always a bad thing to experience. It is actually a feeling that tells us that we need other people, which is a good thing, right? It drives us to connection. It's persistent or sustained loneliness that leads to persistent mental health and physical health problems. But on a whole, we shouldn't be afraid when we feel occasional loneliness or even seasons of loneliness, because that also tells us something about what we desire, about what we long for, and it also can motivate us in the direction of those gaps. Which brings me to my next tip. Approach people around you, not just people you want to date, but all people, as another person in the human race who has something to teach you about the world, perhaps about yourself as you interact with them, and if you're a religious person, about God as well. If you're standing in line and tempted to scroll on your phone, could you talk to the person in front of you or behind you, to ask them how their day is going or what brought them into the store today? There's actually a body of happiness research that suggests that those who, when they go into a coffee house or to a store and speak and have a conversation with a stranger, leave that encounter happier than those who just went in and made the transaction. So there's something about personalizing transactions that makes us happier. I think that could also go into the data diary of how do you feel the next time you're waiting in line. Don't pull out your phone. If you're at the train station tomorrow waiting for your train, talk to the person standing next to you instead of scrolling on Instagram. See if it makes you feel any better afterwards. Also be patient. I found that people don't always expect you to be so friendly. So you might get someone that feels a little weirded out by it and they might brush you off. Try again and keep trying. Don't take it so personally. In a similar vein, adopt a mindset of curiosity. I would say even with longstanding friends and family. Our online consumption of content has shaped us to consume in a very two-dimensional way, as we talked about. So we see a snippet and we think, I can't believe they believe that. But we don't always ask why they believe what they believe or why they're motivated by what they're motivated with. So especially when you're in person, pay attention to the other person's body language, their tone, their demeanor. Why are they smiling so big when they're telling you this? ask them, why does this make you so happy? Point it out to them and find out why. Why are they excited about this or that thing? Who or what inspired them to study this or that topic? Dig a little deeper into your relationships than just, hey, how was your day? Those are good questions to ask too. I think that they matter, but I think that asking about the deeper meaning of our lives or the deeper things that are motivating us in day to day could really be a help not only in forming and sustaining deep relationships, but also in alleviating loneliness. There's a song that came on my radio on my drive up, and if you like country, you may have heard it because I think it's kind of popular right now. I'm not sure. I'm not really endorsing the song. It's by Kenny Chesney. It's called Tip of My Tongue, and there's a lot of lyrics I didn't like about it. But the two lines in the chorus that struck me is he says, it's a long way down to where I want to go. It's a long way down to the center of your soul. What makes up a person, their thoughts, their feelings, what motivates them, are much more complex than any profile, text, tweet, or snap can ever reveal. Oftentimes, we send out that stuff, not always realizing the deeper stuff that's motivating us to send it out. It's true. It's a long way down to the center of a soul, and thankfully, marriage gives us a lifetime for that pursuit. There's a lot of data contained in these little computers we carry around, but there's a lot more data in the people who control those computers. May we know when to use the computer and when to use our own minds and hearts to reach the depths of the souls we seek to love. Thank you.